Welcome to the best of first-person episodes from Phantoms and Monsters. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of all future uploads.
Leather gloves and sunglasses. I was referred to you by a friend who is a subscriber to your newsletter. I recently had an experience that I cannot explain. I was hoping you or someone you know could help with an explanation. I work for a limousine service in New York City and on 24-hour call. A few nights ago, I received a text message from the dispatcher around 9:30 p.m. and was instructed to pick up a client who would be arriving at the Westchester County Airport at midnight. Though I'm on 24-hour call, I rarely receive late-night calls, especially for a pickup outside of the city. I decided to leave as soon as possible since I wasn't really familiar with the Westchester area. I arrived at the gate to the airport and was instructed to park in a waiting section not far off the tarmac. I could see the entire runway from my position. At 11:45 p.m. I received another text message from the dispatcher that repeated the client's name and where I would be taking her. I was instructed that I may be in service for an extended period since the client had several errands to make in the city and that I would need to return her to the airport when she was finished. This was very strange since I usually take a client from point A to point B, though I will occasionally run across an odd request. A little after midnight, there was a knock out on the passenger window. I looked over and noticed a young woman with sunglasses. I stepped out of limo and asked if I could help her. It was the client. I was totally confused because no private jet landed and I never saw her walk up to the limo. Anyway, I opened the back door for her. I returned to the driver's seat as she handed me a list of locations she wanted to stop at. I noticed that all were residential addresses, a total of 5 locations. As we started our way back into the city, I noticed that she never removed her sunglasses, but seemed to be reading a document in the dark. As well, she never spoke and only nodded or motioned her gloved hands. We stopped at the first location, which in the Upper East Side. She simply got out of the limo on her own and walked directly into the townhouse. A few minutes later, she returned to the limo and quickly got into the limo by herself. It was the same routine at the other locations, 2 in the West Village, another in Soho, and last residence was in the Lower East Side, where she remained for close to 2.5 hours. After we were finished, I asked if she wanted to return to the airport and she nodded in the affirmative. I noticed that she acted very tired and was more pale than before. We finally reached the airport around 6:15 a.m. as it was just starting to turn daylight. As I pulled up to the gate, she suddenly opened the door and got out. She walked around to my side and motioned for me to open the window. As I was doing this, she reached into her small briefcase and removed 5 $100 bills and handed it to me. I looked up at her as she smiled and spoke in a very weak, high-pitched voice saying, "Go home now, remember me." Then she turned around and walked quickly toward the hangars. I was simply dumbfounded. What did she mean? I started to back the limo out of the access road when suddenly I felt a warm rush of air and a bright flash. The next thing I remember is waking up in bed in my uniform. I rushed out of bed and looked out the window to see if the limo was parked in my driveway. The limo was there as usual, so I went outside and looked inside. On the front passenger's seat lay the 5 $100 bills. When I looked into the back seat, there were a pair of long leather gloves and the sunglasses worn by the client. Can you possibly explain what happened to me? I have suffered no ill effects from this incident, but feel that something else will happen. What did she mean by, "remember me"? Any information you can provide would be most appreciated. SM.
Gollum in the City, bizarre humanoid in downtown Chicago. What I'm going to tell you is the honest truth. I've had experiences before, but this incident, I still doubt as to what I saw. This happened 2 summers ago, 2018, in downtown Chicago. If you've ever been to downtown Chicago during the summer, after working hours, you know how crowded it can get. I've been living here 13 years, and I've seen my share of homeless weirdos. I commute using the subway every day, and seen some weird people. The city has many, and at first that's what I brushed this sighting off as. I was walking to the comic book store coming up to State Street. There's lots of shoppers and tourists going about their business when I saw what I will refer to as a homeless man on a corner on his knees. It was only when I looked at him again that I was confused. He looked like a Caucasian man that had a scar on his face that made him look a little deformed. He was wearing an oversized hat, but I could see he was bald. He was on his knees and muttering something, partially covering his face. I've never stared at someone before, but there I was in the middle of State Street, shocked and confused. He didn't look normal. His eyes were huge, and I felt really sorry for him. His facial expressions just had lots of sorrow. I looked around to see if anyone had noticed him. A young boy in his teens with his dad was looking at this thing the same way I was. I heard his dad tell the young boy not to look at him, but I could see the boy was also in shock and confused. He also knew that wasn't a human. Something about this humanoid was not right. Everyone else who walked by dared not look and ignored this humanoid. It was my signal to cross the street and I walked away, but I kept turning around to get a glimpse. The last thing I remember that was odd was how his eyes blinked. It reminded a lot of Smeagol from the Lord of the Rings movie. He didn't look real. I think about this sighting a lot and sometimes brush it off as it was just a weird-looking homeless human. The more I recall the sighting, the more I'm convinced it was not a human. That's exactly what this thing was doing. Trying to hide in plain sight in front of hundreds of people. Its mannerisms were strange too. The way it kept its head down, but occasionally looking up to make eye contact, was bizarre. It almost felt like I was looking at a wild animal at a zoo. Very bizarre. AC.
Bizarre entities in dark Swedish forest. I am an au pair in Sweden and spend most summer weekends in my family's summer house, which is out in the archipelago outside of Stockholm. Breathtakingly beautiful place, but boonies doesn't even begin to cover it. The nearest neighbor is about a 30-minute brisk walk away. And after that there's nothing except ocean and thick, terrifying forest. This particular night was date night for the parents, so I was left with the two children alone out in the terrifying house. There are two houses on the property, one main house, and the other is a guest house, where of course I got to sleep all alone. It's literally 2 meters from the ocean. The game plan was to go exploring in the forest, which I had never done alone with the children, only with the parents, and then walk to pick up my boyfriend from the bus stop. He would stay with us until the parents got home from their date, and then my boyfriend and I would go sleep in the guest house. So, while in the forest, I kept getting the jitters. Things were definitely stranger, and it wasn't just because I was alone with two children. I grew up in the forest. But several times we heard the birds calling out these weird distress call noises, and big flocks would appear, a long time before we were even close enough to scare them. And there were big thudding footsteps nearby. I was terrified of there being a moose or something. We came to a little hidden lake, and then things got even weirder. Though the place is unpopulated for miles, there was a woman sitting on a rock opposite us, about 60 feet away. She was naked and wet as though she'd been swimming, even though the water was much too cold for that. When she saw us, she stood up and did this weird pacing thing, like she would get close to the water and then back away, then move close again. Like she wanted to cross and come toward us, but there was the obvious lake barrier in the way. The kids were mildly worried, and it wasn't long before I ushered them back the way we'd come, and we made our way out of the forest. On the road to pick up my boyfriend, I had the oddest sensation of being watched. I was really terrified actually. But we met him with no incident and returned to the cabin just as the sun was setting. We gave the kids dinner, and just as they were curling up with a Swedish comic book, the main door slammed open. I really remember thinking it was a real person. There was a heavy footfall and then bam. Like someone had stomped and flung open the door. But there was no one there. My boyfriend went out and had a look around. Nothing. Must have been the wind, of course, right? It's always the wind. While we were in bed reading the story, we could hear skittering around and clawing from underneath where we were. I knew for a fact that rats and other rodents camped out at the other end of the house, because that's where the kitchen was. I had a really awful feeling in the pit of my stomach, but my rational boyfriend promised me it was a fox or weasel, and not to get worked up. Fast forward to 3 a.m. I had to pee. My boyfriend and I were in the guest house. My bosses had come home long ago. Right after I had finished, I straightened and adjusted my shirt, but I got that awful feeling of dread. I had it in the forest, I had it on the way to see my boyfriend, I had it while we were camped out inside the house. I had felt just fine in the guest house with my boyfriend, but now the feeling was back. Behind the guest house is a steep hill, about a 45-degree angle, and on that hill sits what we call the ghost house. It was the house of an old soldier in the 1600s, and now it just sits there vacant. There's a trail going from the ghost house to the main summer home, and my boss had lit the trail with dim solar lamps. You can't see how to read by the light of the lamps, but the idea was to light your way up the hill and not trip and die over a tree root. I could sense something moving up the trail. That means something moving from the main house to the ghost house. I squinted in the dark and saw a shape of a person, but that wasn't right because by the solar light you can see color, jeans or shirts or jackets, and ours all had reflectors on them, but this was just a black shadow. I thought animal, but then ruled that out, because it was 2 legs, walking really fast and smoothly, but then it slowed and seemed to notice me. I was actually terrified, but my intuition told me to commence stare down, so I did. I was fighting to see in the dark, and just when I couldn't focus, I realized there were 2 very softly illuminated eyes on its face. And they were on me. It slowed down to a stroll, and I could see the eyes change tint from a bluish to yellowish glow based on where they were in relation to the solar lamps. They were catching light, so I stared. It was going so slow now this felt surreal, and I could hear twigs snapping, and other noises that a real-life non-imagined creature makes. I remember actually thinking this isn't a hallucination, it's freaking walking on the ground. And then the weirdest part got him instead of moving at a normal, relative height the way human eyes, or animal eyes, would do, the eyes started kind of hovering. They were 6 feet off the ground, suddenly would dip down to 4 feet, then back up to 5. And they never left me. But the direction this thing was moving in never changed, it kept going up the hill. The eyes and the figure faded out into the darkness once the solar lamps ended, and I went back into the guest house and locked the door. I heard nothing else that night. My boyfriend slept through everything, but early in the morning he woke up whimpering from a nightmare. And that's the only time anything has ever happened at that summer house, and I was there collectively a month. R.A.
Bizarre humanoid attempts to board bus in Chicago suburb. Tonight was a wild night, one that I'll never forget. I had my Scooby-Doo umbrella by my side after a good day, and I was headed back home on a public bus. I believe it was a Pace, and I was pretty much alone. Just me and the bus driver and 1 or 2 other people. That in and of itself was strange, but I'm not sure that was related. Anyways, I board the bus and the bus driver is stopping off at plenty of locations, and we arrived to one where there's little to no light around it, no street lamps, no houses or buildings, no nothing. The only thing illuminating the scene was the dim light inside the bus and the headlights. The bus driver opened the doors and nobody budges, but as the bus driver began to close the doors, we heard these really heavy footsteps come out of nowhere. Then I heard the most god-awful sound I have ever heard. It wasn't quite screaming, it wasn't singing, but it sounded angry. The bus driver began to open the doors again for the thing to board, but as soon as it came into eyesight, nobody wanted that thing to board this bus. The driver shut the doors as quickly as he could, and this creature became infuriated. It was wearing women's clothing, an orange shirt and an orange hat with some shorts. It's been hot here. But that thing was not like any women I've ever seen. I don't even know how to describe it. It could have the power to shapeshift, if that's a thing. This thing, it was a she, or at least wanted to appear so, began pounding on the bus doors, howling its angry, screaming song. It went on for a long time. The bus driver was clearly in shock and confused and downright scared, as he should be. Hell, I was scared too. I don't think any of us knew what to do. And at the same time, we weren't sure if this thing would follow us. If we did let the creature in, would it harm us? Kill us even? Would it chase after us if we didn't? If we called the police and it left, would they even believe us? It wasn't any kind of cryptid like Bigfoot or the Chupacabra. Without a doubt, it was an extraterrestrial life form. It is an experience I will not forget ever in my life. The first thing I did when I arrived home was look up anything similar, to no avail. So I came to report it.
This is Lon Strickler. If you like this program, it would help us if you would give it a thumbs up. Then subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notification when we upload new first-person encounters. We have many more to come very soon. And by the way, if you have a suggestion or an experience of your own, please leave a comment.